Hello and welcome to Let's Try Again, a Harry Potter-oriented fanfiction. Post-war, when Harry's world is falling apart, then he is offered a second chance to try and make a better future for himself and his friends. However, nothing is ever simple for Harry Potter, so buckle in and enjoy the ride. Chapter 1. From the Future to the Past. Department of Mysteries, August 26th, 2018. On the deepest level of the Ministry of Magic, in the least known section of the Department of Mysteries, a dark-haired man sat at a well-used desk reading what looked like an ancient scroll by candlelight in silence when an alarm started to go off. Unspeakable Emerald, an inside joke from his recruiter, calmly got up and tucked the scroll into his trunk before shrinking the trunk and turning it in his pocket. Hadrian Jameson Charles Prince Potter, more commonly known as Harry James Potter, made his way into the DOM's ritual room at a calm pace. Normally when alarms started sounding, most people would panic and start to rush, but that wasn't him, not anymore at least. Many years ago, when he was a teenager maybe, but not anymore. They had made sure of that. At the age of 17, when most other children were having fits of teenage rebellion, Harry had been leading a rebellion. He had willingly walked to his death, only to find out it wasn't worth it less than a year later. Less than a week after the final battle, Dumbledore had come forward. He explained that he had faked his death so that he could do more research unwatched. Everyone accepted that it had been for the greater good. If Albus said it, it had to be true. Harry had been feeling off that entire week, but it wasn't until the funerals started that he realized something was wrong. He stood next to the Weasley family at Fred's funeral, but he didn't cry. In fact, he attended dozens of funerals and never once cried. It was at the funeral of Remus Lupin that he figured out why. It was because he felt nothing. Thinking back, he realized that ever since the battle, he had not felt a single emotion. But that wasn't right. He had willingly walked to his death before facing the most feared Dark Lord in single combat, and during it all, he had felt nothing. When he told his best and most trusted friends, he was told that it was just shock. He would get over it in time. He just needed to let himself relax. But time went by, and still he felt nothing. It had almost been a full year later that he learned why. Harry had been sitting in Chief Ragnarok's, Director of Gringotts' office. He was there to finalize the repayment for breaking in and releasing the dragon. Seeing something in Harry's eyes, Ragnarok called in another goblin. They then performed an inheritance test. What they discovered caused Harry's world to flip. Harry was not the son of Lily and James Potter, but instead he was the son of Severus Snape and James Potter. He was the Lord of 8 houses, and that wasn't the worst of it. There was evidence that he had been under loyalty, submission, and compulsion potions since he had been a young child. Blocks had been placed on his magic. The first was placed on November 1st, 1991. The second block was placed when he was 2, and the others were placed when he was 5, 11, 13, and 16. He was also under glamours, all of which bore the magical signature of Albus Dumbledore. There was also a block on his soulmate bond, and he had been dosed with over 200 different love potions, a vast majority of which were aimed at Ginny Weasley. Ragnarok explained that was why he was no longer able to feel anything. His body had been fighting against the soulmate block since it had been placed when he was only 4 months old. With the addition of the potions, it had caused his emotions to burn out. The goblin healer that had been brought in to remove all the potion residue, spells, glamours, and bindings that were on him theorized that all his emotions since the age of 16 had been potion or spell induced. Sitting in the healing wing of Gringotts, Harry, now Hadrian, swore that he would get revenge. A light knock on the door had drawn everyone's attention, as they watched an elderly female goblin with pale eyes walk in, holding hands with none other than Luna Lovegood. Luna went and sat next to Hadrian and gave him a hug before explaining. Luna told them that she had seer blood and knew that everything was about to change. She couldn't see the specifics, but she did have information. The goblin seer that she had came in with said that they would both help. They explained that they had seen a way to fix everything, but it would come at a great cost and great risk. There was no guarantee that it would work. They said that terrible things were about to happen, and there was nothing any of them can do to stop it. When the time was right, the brightest of the lions would come and show Hadrian how to find the light in the darkness. In time, they would find a way to cause the sands to reverse and give them a second chance, a chance to break the chains. Hadrian agreed to wear glamours so that Dumbledore and those that worked for him wouldn't know that he had discovered their treachery. He actually found it really easy to play the role of a double agent. Hadrian realized that he was doing the same thing as his father, Severus, had been forced to do. Over the next few months, what remained of Hadrian's world fell apart. Dumbledore passed laws that were drafted by none other than Hermione, that forced all house elves to be freed, outlawed all dark creatures, and made it illegal to have a dark core. The first thing Hadrian had done when he heard about those laws was to go to Andromeda's and try and convince her to take Teddy and run. That was where he learned of more deception. Like him, Remus had been dosed with love potions. Tonks had only pretended to marry him to make sure that he didn't try and take Harry away like he and Sirius had been planning. Teddy wasn't really his son, but the son of Tonks and Moody of all people. He had left quickly before she could call anyone and gone to the next place he could think of, Shell Cottage, only to find it in flames. Running inside, he had found Arthur Weasley. He had been hit with multiple cutting hexes amongst other things. There was nothing Hadrian could do but watch him die. Arthur told him that the ministry had taken Bill, Fleur, and Victoire. Hadrian had removed Arthur's body from the house and laid him to rest next to Dobby. It took days of searching for information at the ministry to find out where they had been taken. Ultimately, he had made arrangements with George and Charlie to see if they could get them out of the country. Unfortunately, they were not as successful as they had hoped. Hadrian had managed to slip into the prison camp, but it was already too late for Bill and Fleur. Going past the cells, he saw a few people he recognized and started opening the doors. They opened as many doors as they could in order to cause a distraction and at least give a few people a chance. A few of the students that he had gone to school with, including Draco Malfoy, chose to follow him as he headed to where the children were being held. In one small building in the middle of the compound, there was 11 children between the age of 3 to only a few months. The conditions were terrible, and it was clear that no one had been looking after them. Hadrian and the others gathered the children up before they used the portkeys he had brought with them to get away. They had been lucky. It seemed that all of the so-called light's morals were only for show, as the entire place had been destroyed with fiend fire. That was the last time he would see many of them, though he did manage to set up a back-channel communication with George, Charlie, Draco, and Blaise Zabini later. For the most part, most of what had happened that night had been covered up, but Hadrian had managed to use his fame to start an inquest. He pointed out that many old pureblood families had been attacked, and that they didn't want to risk another Dark Lord issue. Less than 6 months into the inquest, Hadrian had collapsed. He had woken up in St. Mungo's a few hours later and had been told that he had been slipped a very rare poison and that there was no cure. All they could do was keep him comfortable. His so-called friends and pretend family showed up and cried for the cameras, but they never really spent any time with him, which he was grateful for. One night, Hadrian had woken up, feeling like he was being watched. Sitting beside his bed had been a person in unspeakable robes. When the hood had lowered, Hadrian had almost felt something. For a moment he could have sworn that he was looking at Sirius Black, but then he noticed the small differences between this man and his beloved godfather. Sitting next to him was none other than Regulus Black. That was when the first part of what Luna had said made sense. The star Regulus was the brightest star in the Leo constellation. Regulus had told Hadrian about how after he had sent Creature home with the locket, he had been attacked by the Amphorae in the water. A combination of the madness from the potion, the fear of death, and accidental magic, it had allowed him to apparate through the anti-apparition wards around the cave. Except that the effort involved almost killed him. He had actually been discovered comatose in a Muggle hospital 8 years later by an unspeakable that had then recruited him. He was now only known as Unspeakable Onks, another, inside, unspeakable joke. He had told Hadrian that the Unspeakable Department could offer him a cure for the poison if he was willing to work for them. That night, Harry Potter had died, and Unspeakable Emerald was born. The Unspeakables had been tracking the actions of Dumbledore since Voldemort had started his rise. They had seen a pattern in the fact that a second Dark Lord was connected to Dumbledore. Shortly after Harry's death, a woman came forward with an incredible story. She claimed that her husband had been the illegitimate brother of James Potter. This meant that her 4-year-old son was the heir to the Potter fortune. The Goblins had administered the inheritance test and proved that the boy Brian was indeed a Potter. They were forbidden by treaty to tell the public any more than that the boy was a Potter. Ragnarok had secretly told Hadrian the truth. The boy was the son of James Potter and Lily Evans. After a few months of investigating, Hadrian learned the truth. Voldemort had not actually killed anyone the night in Godric's Hollow, but instead he had killed golems. Lily Evans had, with the help of Dumbledore, placed James Potter in a magical coma and kidnapped him days before the attack. James had been kept prisoner. They had wanted Lily to give birth to another Potter heir so that when Harry died, as they had already planned, Lily would be able to come forward under a fake identity and claim the Potter estates. Hadrian had eventually found the cottage that had been James's prison in the woods just outside Godric's Hollow. They hadn't even had the decency to bury the body. The corpse of James Potter still rested on a cot in a locked room in the basement. An autopsy performed in the Department of Mysteries showed that James had been kept unconscious the entire time. They had given him potions to assist Lily in getting pregnant. It had taken them a long time because James was a natural carrier. This meant that he was able to magically become pregnant and carry a child, but it was incredibly difficult for him to impregnate someone. Over the years, the Unspeakables had discovered that Dumbledore had been working closely with Grindelwald. One of the Unspeakables had managed to get into Numengard to question him. Grindelwald had explained that they had planned to play both sides of the chessboard. He would be black and Dumbledore would be white. They would use each other to get rid of anyone they didn't deem worthy, and in the end they would compromise and reconcile to make their world a better place. Ultimately, Dumbledore had betrayed him when Grindelwald was getting too powerful. Dumbledore had invited him to a strategy meeting and attacked without warning, taking the Elder Wand in the process, before locking him up in the prison they had built together. Dumbledore had then made himself out to be the hero, rather than the villain he was. Within a few hours of Hadrian's final defeat of Voldemort, the Unspeakables had gone into his manor. They had found all sorts of things, the most interesting of which was a book on how to create Horcruxes. The book still held residue from compulsions cast 50 years before, meaning that the compulsions had been incredibly strong. Each time Voldemort had touched the book, he would have felt compelled to make another Horcrux. Horcruxes didn't just divide one's soul, they divided the mind. This was why Voldemort had lost his mind. Over the next few years after Harry Potter had died, things went from bad to worse. The freeing of the House Elves caused them to become almost extinct in Wizarding Britain. House Elves needed the connection to a wizard to supply and regulate their magic. Without that connection, the House Elves' magic goes wild and ultimately kills them. The only reason they were not completely extinct was because some people that actually understood the symbiotic relationship between wizards and elves had hidden them away and kept them bound to themselves. This included all the unspeakables. The next to go was the magical creatures. Magical creatures do not differentiate between light and dark. They also generally do not have the same hatred issues as humans. Werewolves and vampires may not have the best relationships, but given the choice between helping one another or siding with the wizards that had persecuted both of them, they will never choose the wizards. Once the magical creatures saw their magical brethren being rounded up and experimented, they turned on the wizards. Once all different types of magical creatures started to turn on the wizards, the Ministry, under the continued influence of Dumbledore and his followers, decided to make all magical creatures a target. To the rest of the magical world, they could only watch in horror and confusion as the British Ministry of Magic legalised the hunting of everything from basilisks, unicorns, to even phoenixes. As phoenixes cannot be truly killed, Fawkes was trapped in a binding cage that had somehow been spelled to bind him. He wasn't there long, as soon as Adrian and the other unspeakables learned of his fate, and the fate of another phoenix in Britain, they had broken into Hogwarts, where they had been held and rescued them. Fawkes, for his part, was found to be under an old magic binding curse, forcing him to do what Dumbledore wanted. He was kept in the cage until they were able to find a ritual that could free him. After being freed, Fawkes chose to stay mostly in the DOM and help the unspeakables. The average witch and wizard by this point had started to pull away from Dumbledore's greater good. There was discomfort turning into fury when the Ministry cost them their gold. All of a sudden, the public cared, but by then it was too late to save them, as they had not bothered to help anyone else and therefore had no allies. The event that had caused outrage was when the Ministry attacked Gringotts with Dementors. The Ministry had used their control over the Dementors to force them into the bank before sealing the doors. They had expected the Dementors would wipe out the Goblins, but they were wrong. It was true that a great number of Goblins died in the initial attack, but Goblins know the secrets of Dementors, their origin. Many people knew that the Obscurials were amongst the most dangerous things in existence, but they also thought that they were rare. That was not the truth. It was just rare for them to fully form. As a child, Hadrian thought he was the only student in Hogwarts that was being abused. He was wrong. The abuse of magical children by their Muggle relatives was actually more common than they had known. Most cases were only minor, but more severe cases did exist. It was even more common in the past. Everyone knew that severely abused children could become Obscurials, but they never considered what happened if they died before they manifested. Most children that are abused severely enough to start the process of becoming an Obscurial don't survive. When a children like that dies, the Obscurial magic attached to their soul doesn't allow them to move on. Instead, they become Dementors. They feed off others' happiness in attempts to provide comfort to the child that they used to be, while at the same time trying to let those around them understand how they feel. Although it is relatively rare in modern times, it does happen. Knowing this, the Goblins used an ancient ritual to release the souls of the children. It was a very complex ritual that used many different forms of magic. The only way to release the souls of the children was to strip away the Dementor exterior and acknowledge the child beneath. Then allow the child to explain their pain, followed by providing the spirit with the comfort and love that they never received. It was very difficult to do because not many had the physical and emotional strength required. The goblins had managed to release all the children over a 12-day period. Dumbledore and the Mystery had believed that it would take about a week for the Dementors to wipe out the Goblin Nation, but had kept the building sealed for 2 weeks just to be on the safe side. They expected that when they opened the doors, they would find their hoarded Dementors surrounded by soulless husks of the entire Goblin Nation. Once the goblins were dead, they would simply take control of the bank and confiscate the gold. That was not what happened. 2 weeks after sealing the doors, they cracked them open and sent their Patronuses in. When they stepped in, they almost found a completely empty bank lobby. The chandelier and even the teller desks had been removed. The only thing in the room was a single table, sitting in the middle of the room. On that table was the most recent peace treaty with the Goblin Nation, and it was torn in half. They all knew what it meant. It was war. Months went by, and the Ministry started to relax as there were no attacks by the Goblin. There was new problems, though. The people. They had been so supremely confident in their ability to take control of the bank that they never considered what would happen if they failed. The tunnels that led into the heart of the nation, as well as down to the vaults, had been sealed shut with goblin magic. This meant that no one had access to their gold. Almost overnight, the economy collapsed. The Ministry tried to keep control, but they were struggling. The people were angry, and small rebellions started. The Ministry's response was brutal, but it never stopped some people. Like the goblins, many magical creatures decided to bunk down and let the stupid little wizards destroy themselves. The only people that they had any real contact with was the Unspeakables, and Hadrian in particular. Learning from the different species allowed them to form a plan. Using time crystals from the Goblin caves, they were ground to dust to make time turners, as well as rituals from centaurs, mermaids, silkies, elves, goblins, as well as many others. They found a way to reverse time itself and give them a second chance. The next year and a half was spent getting everything ready. It was decided that Hadrian would be the one to go back. This was due in part to the fact that he had used all 3 of the Deathly Hallows, and if there was any truth in that story, then he could be considered Master of Death. It was hoped that this would help him, though no one was sure. All the information they could gather was stored in dimensional trunks that were shrunk and placed inside another one, and the outer trunk was covered in shards of time crystals. They gathered thousands of memories. There was no way knowing if Hadrian would remember this timeline, but they hoped the information in the trunks would help. He even managed to get memory balls, something similar to a pensieve, that projected a holograph image of a person from many people, including Charlie, George, and Draco. Hadrian had used forks to visit them when he brought Brian to George. They had been capturing and interrogating a lot of Dumbledore's people in their attempt to get as much information as possible. That included Lily Evans. That was when Hadrian had learned that Lily somehow managed to be an even worse parent than her sister Petunia. Although Hadrian had come to hate Lily as much as he did Dumbledore, he sympathised with his younger half-brother. It wasn't his fault that Lily was his mother. Hadrian had used Creature to get past the wards and into Potter Manor, where Dumbledore had established his base of operations. He had Potter blood in his veins, so he couldn't be warded out. When he found the now 7-year-old boy in a small room in the basement, he knew that he had done the right thing. Gently, Hadrian explained who he was, and then asked if Brian wanted to leave. The scared, underweight, and bruised little boy didn't even hesitate before throwing himself into Hadrian's arms, begging to never have to come back. Hadrian saw so much of the boy he once was in this little boy. Brian seemed to be the opposite of how Hadrian had been when he had been under Dumbledore's glamours. The glamours had made him look exactly like James with Lily's eyes, but Brian was the opposite. His hair and face looked like Lily's, but he had their father's hazel eyes. It was clear that the boy wasn't being looked after properly and was being abused. As a final screw you before leaving, Hadrian sent all the files and paperwork that he had been in the manor to the DOM before blood sealing the property. Hadrian then took Brian to Prague, where Charlie, George and Victoire were currently living. Hadrian's friendship with George had been strained since the war, though he had no idea why, but they had learned to deal with each other. Again, after Hadrian had explained about his inability to feel, though their relationship was complicated, when Hadrian told him that he believed Brian was being abused, George had instantly offered to adopt the boy. While he had been dropping off Brian, now renamed Gabrielle, George and Charlie had given him their message orbs. The plan was to send Hadrian back to just after the fateful trip to the zoo, but before he received his Hogwarts letters. This time was chosen because after the zoo incident, Hadrian had received one of the worst beatings he had to endure before he started school. There was no doubt in Hadrian's mind that he had been close to death. They hoped that this fact would allow him to merge with and overtake his past self. There were many people that had been willing to help him. It was an odd mix and match of people from all of the houses, all wanting a chance for a better life. That was what led up to today. The alarm meant that they had found out. Faye Dunbar, who had been in Gryffindor in the same year as Hadrian, though they had never really interacted, had been alerting him. She worked as a secretary in the minister's office. Kingsley had retired a few years ago, and Hermione had gotten her dream of becoming the youngest Minister of Magic. She was as terrible at it as Hadrian had expected. She also hated the Unspeakables and the DOM. This was because, although the Unspeakables worked in the ministry, they did not answer to the minister. It was in the Unspeakables' contracts that their only loyalty was to Lady Magic herself. Hermione and Dumbledore thought that they would have access to all the information in the DOM once she was minister. They were wrong though. It didn't stop them from trying to force their way in. They had even tried sending a few spies, but they had quickly found out and sent packing. The Unspeakables had taken more and more risks lately. They knew that they were close to being found out, so they had to throw caution to the wind. The alarm meant that Dumbledore knew that Unspeakable Emerald was Hadrian, and that they were now on their way to the DOM to get rid of him. As Hadrian got in place for the ritual, Unspeakables Opal and Amber entered the room. Lowering their hoods, Hadrian looked at the faces of his most loyal friends, Luna and Neville. Taking their positions, they started the ritual. While they were doing the ritual, something started pounding on the door. Standing in the centre of the ritual's rooms, Hadrian's world started to spin as they finished the ritual. As his vision began to tunnel, Hadrian could only watch as the door burst open and in walked people he hated most. Dumbledore, Hermione, Ron, Molly and Lily all came into the room throwing curses. Hadrian watched as both Luna and Neville fell. Then Dumbledore himself threw the killing curse at Hadrian, just as the world went black. Pocket Universe. No time. Sitting in a far-off dimension, fate, destiny, death and time were in deep discussion. They were trying to figure out what to do. Should they let Hadrian go back, or should they stop him? Fate wanted to allow Hadrian his second chance, as she felt that she had been cheated by her sister Destiny. Fate had had such great plans for Hadrian until Destiny had messed everything up one day when she had been in a bad mood. Destiny wasn't sure. She did think that it would be entertaining to watch Hadrian go up again. That boy certainly knew how to get himself into interesting situations. Death, like Destiny, was conflicted. He wanted to let his master have this chance, as it would make it so that he didn't have to collect all the souls he had to. So many had died before their time because Dumbledore didn't know his place. At the same time, he hated the idea of having a master. Hadrian had been the only person to ever gather all the Hallows in one place, and even though he was going back in time, he would still be his master. Having a master was bad enough, but having a master that was a child was even worse. Time was completely against it. He hated when mortals messed with him, and Hadrian had done so already with the whole Time Turner mess. It wasn't his fault that fate and destiny had never learned to be careful with their toys. After centuries in their little pocket universe, the immortal beings agreed that they would give Hadrian a second chance, but they didn't want him knowing everything, as Destiny said, that would take all the fun out of it. So they made sure that his memories would be vague. They sent Hadrian's unconscious soul back through time and left to go about their business. None of the others saw Destiny slip back into the room with a devious smirk on her face. She just couldn't resist messing with one of her sister's favourites and her brother's new master. With a quick gesture, she added her own twist on the ritual Hadrian had performed and giggled as she snuck back out of the room. Fate was going to be so mad at her, but it was going to be so much fun. Thank you for listening to this chapter. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again next time for Chapter 2.